Greetings, everybody, and welcome to the World Fund Seminar. Before we get started, a few logistics. During the session today, you have the option to use the chat pane or the questions and answers pane, which you can see in your meeting controls at the bottom of the screen. Please use the chat pane for comments or general discussions. It's the icon with the single word bubble. And if you have a specific question for the panelists, use the Q&A pane, the icon with the double word bubble. We have had some issues with the chat pane recently, so if it stops working, you are always welcome to use the question and answer pane. My name is Nora Zai, Senior Director of Programs and Member Services, and I'll be moderating the session today. By now, most of you have learned the policy changes related to the World Fund. And today we hope to bring more clarity to those changes through a discussion with a panel of experts. Today you will hear from the following trustees: Trustee Chair-elect John Germ from Tennessee, USA, and Trustee Barry Rassin from the Bahamas. We also have with us representation from Rotary International staff, Chief Programs and Member Services Officer Jim Barnes, Chief Financial Officer Julie Burke, and Chief Philanthropy Officer Eric Schmeling. We received many questions from you in advance of the session and plan to address those questions received most frequently. And as I mentioned before, you can also submit the questions throughout the session and we will do our best to answer them in our short time together. If we don't get to your question during the session, we will follow up over email. It is my pleasure to welcome John Germ to get us started.
Well, thank you very much, Nora. This is an interesting process that we've been going through. And, I'd like to say that if you look at this chart, but we're meeting not so much to talk about a perceived problem, but to talk about the great success and to celebrate the success of the work that the Rotary Foundation has been doing and is doing. I don't think that we ever thought that we would be doing as many global grants as we're doing, because back in 2013-14, we had a total of global grants were introduced. The foundation did 868 global grants worth $47.3 million, and we thought that that was great work. But as we continued to grow by 19 and 20, the number of global grants awarded had been risen to 1,359. And as you can see on this chart, we had distributed $95.6 million. The first 6 months of this year, we've already approved 1,197 global grants worth $87.5 million. And if you compare that to last year, we had 634 global grants for $46.4 million. So you can see that the needs are increasing around the world. Rotarians are seeing those needs and trying to find ways to fulfill that. So all of this work sounds great, but as a result of that, if you continue to look at this chart, you will see that the annual program fund, which is contributions, which is where the majority of the World Fund comes from, has grown only by 6%, whereas the global grant needs have grown by 102%. So you can see the disparity there. And so we needed to think about what we need to do. Last year, we ran out of funds for the global grants about the 15th of May. And this year, the projections were we were going to run out by mid-December. So we were quite worried that we needed to do something and that we needed to continue to try to find ways to fulfill the request from the Rotarians in order to fund grants. So first option we had, obviously, was to say, okay, whatever money we have, that's the money we'll spend. And after that, we'll just quit. And then we said, no, that don't make sense. We need to find other ways to do this. So let's see if we can't find a way to reduce our operating costs. So we went into the process of evaluating what can we do to reduce operating costs. And we made a decision that nothing was sacred, that we could do whatever was necessary in order to fulfill the desires of the Rotarians. So we decided, how do we stretch these funds? So through cost savings, we were able to reduce about $4.4 million in the foundation for cost savings and in Rotary. Then we decided, okay, what do we really need to do to move this program forward? TRF has a reserve. It's mandated by the bylaws. It's supposed to be 3 times your annual operating cost. We're not at 3 times our annual operating costs in the reserves, but we did decide that we would take $7.5 million from our reserves in order to put into the World Fund for Global Grants. We asked the Rotary International Board of Directors to match that with $7.5 million from the savings that they've had from travel and other costs, of which they did. So that gives us an additional about $20 million that we can do it. But let me say quite frankly, this is not sustainable because we cannot continue to take funds out of the reserve. We hope we get back to normal business operations from Rotary International, and that the travel goes back up. The governors can do travel. Everyone can be back doing business as, quote, semi-normal. And so we said, we've got to provide sufficient funds that gets us through the mid-June. So that $20 million gets us there. But based on the continued growth of the global grant request, you can tell from this next slide that we need a total of about $17.6 million annually, beginning with the 21-22 Rotary year. So we reviewed our sources of funds and adopted 4 items which will provide additional funds to meet Rotarian requests, which we were going to be discussed with you today, hopefully in enough detail that you will have a clearer understanding of what we have done. But if you could draw an example, it's kind of like we're in a situation where a couple has 4 children. We've got enough food for 2 of them. Now we can either tell them to rush to the table and grab what they can, and whoever gets there first gets to eat, or we can find ways of giving them less, but make sure everyone has some food. We chose to do the way that we could get people to share more around the world and to share in our global grant program. Now, my friends and fellow trustees will now talk to us about what steps that we have taken to diminish this problem in a manner that we feel is fair to all, of funding our global grants until Rotarians are able to put in more contributions via our annual funds. The secret to the success will be to increase our annual fund giving. So, Barry?
Actually, and if I may interrupt really quick before we move on, thank you for that excellent introduction and sharing the context for how these decisions were made, John. And just to start, I'm going to pipe in with questions as we go through this that we've received. And just to start with some very basics is there, when you looked at that first graph, you saw kind of this gap. You saw the annual fund giving and you saw the World Fund, but there was a gap there. And one might ask, what is the World Fund? Is it only there to provide funding for global grants? And if so, why does that gap exist? So I might ask Julie to expand a little bit on the structure of the World Fund and what it funds.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's nice to be here. So yes, the World Fund has funds various programs, obviously, to a large degree global grants, primarily global grants, but also Polio Plus, programs of scale, and occasionally other grants like disaster response grants. And it also helps to cover program operations and program-related fund development and general administration costs.
Great, thank you so much for that, Julie. So now we'll go into some details about each of the policy changes, and I'll ask Barry to start with the first one.
Thank you, Nora, and thank you, John, for that great overview. We're talking now about our DDF contributions to Polio Plus. 2 years ago, the match on DDF transfers to Polio Plus increased from 50% to 100% in the hopes of attracting more Polio Plus support. However, we actually saw a decrease. So the match has now been restored to 50% effective July 1st, 2021. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation will continue matching 2-to-1 every dollar that Rotary commits to polio eradication up to $50 million per year. The resulting contribution from the Gates Foundation is therefore $100 million. This decision may provide up to an additional $5 million in the World Fund money to support global grants in Rotary year 21-22. And you heard how important our global grant program is and how important it is we're able to fund it. So this is a great step for us. However, we have to remember polio eradication is still our #1 priority, and we will continue to raise our $50 million a year for polio because all of you are such fantastic supporters, and will continue to spread the word that we must raise this $50 million a year. We raise that for polio and to raise awareness by keeping it as a top priority for our clubs, in our communities, and with our government officials. It is our program of highest priority, so we must support it. But by doing this little change, we're able to also support strongly our global grant program. Nora?
Thank you, Barry. And so just to pause there too, so just to underscore, this change will not impact our agreement with the Rotary International Bill and Melinda Gates equation. That was a question that was received frequently, is will this change impact that existing structure? John, is that a question that you can address?
What's about affecting the Gates?
Yeah, the Gates agreement.
This is probably one of the hardest decisions that I had to make. As I said earlier, we said that nothing was off the table when we started evaluating, and we have this agreement with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and that agreement does not change. It's a 2-for-1 match up to $50 million. If we do $50 million, they give us $100 million. And we were successful last year. Even with COVID, we were successful in the fact that we did raise a little over $50 million. And in January of this year, we did receive $100 million from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And let me just say that we have, in January, we did approve $50 million to go to the World Fund and to UNICEF. And then recently we funded another, that was in October, then we did another $50 million in January. So it is critical that we continue to raise this. But it was not sensible for us to put money aside when we weren't reaching the $10 million that we needed to reach in order to get the money out of the World Fund. So that was the reason we made that decision. It's logical. It does give us the $5 million extra in order to provide grants. And if you think the grant would be about $30,000, look at the number of grants that we can now fund simply because of this one decision. Spread the wealth.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that. And John, if you would like to carry on for the decision number 2.
Well, in decision number 2, we debated that for quite a while. And obviously all of these decisions had to be evaluated. We looked at in depth at the impact that we thought it was going to have on our contributions. And the principle behind this decision was to spread the available World Fund over a greater number of grants. That was the basic decision on the first one we had, the first thought that we had. So we said, okay, how do we do that? Well, one way to do it is to simply think about the number of grants we've got. And we know that the World Fund is a finite pot of money, to use Mike Webb's term, or amount of money, dependent on donations made to the annual fund, which we've discussed previously. Those decisions were based on 3 years. As we know, the funds come back after 3 years. So once that money is spent, though, there is no more available. By doing this, where we would do 80% World Fund match, we further leverage the use of the World Fund, and the available funds will be spread over more grants. It could provide an additional $3 million. We certainly hope it's going to provide that or more for global grants beginning in 2024. So we're not touching any of the money that was previously given 3 years ago. So the money that comes in starting July the 1st of 2021 will be under this new policy. It means that those grants, which will be done in 3 years from now, will be done 80% and not the 100% match. So in the current year, as long as the funds are available, that we've still got money left, the DDF transfer will continue to be matched at 100% for all the grants submitted by 31 May and approved by the end of the Rotary year. But once that World Fund money has been exhausted, global grant applications will need to be amended, substituting the 100% match with 80%. While we anticipate that we have set aside enough funds to provide a 100% match for all the approved global grant scholarships that are submitted prior to 30 June, because those applications just went out, any remaining grants will be received at an 80% match. So Nora?
Thanks, John. So this is definitely a policy that generated the most questions out of all. So we'll just really pause here and kind of dig into these questions that we've gotten. So please, continue to submit them over the Q&A, but we're pulling here from the ones that we received in advance of the session. So let's start out with a question about fundraising. So perhaps Eric Schmeling can help with this. Are there ways to donate directly to the World Fund or to designate the World Fund via our normal contributions? And I think this is in the context of what can we do to help provide more funding for these global grants, which is.
Yeah, great question, Nora. Really appreciate that, and really a pleasure to be with everyone today. Thank you. Yeah, there are a couple different ways that Rotarians and supporters of the foundation can help the World Fund directly. The first is to make a contribution to the annual fund and further direct it to annual fund World Fund. The whole gift then would go to the World Fund for more immediate use. A second way of helping the World Fund is by contributing to the endowment fund and further directing that the spendable earnings from that gift be used for the World Fund itself. So there are a couple of good options for donors that might be looking to help beef up or support the World Fund directly.
Thanks, Eric. And then talking about donors, another very commonly asked question is how is this going to impact giving to the World Fund? Are we concerned that this 80% match may decrease giving to the World Fund?
You mean to the annual?
Please, John.
Yeah.
I think that's up to each Rotarian to make that decision. The obvious answer is I don't believe it will. I believe that Rotarians are still interested in providing service in the community. And so I think that they will continue to give to the Annual Programs Fund. But the key to this is Annual Programs Fund. If we want to provide grants And if we want to provide service to our communities around the world through the Global Grant Program, we have to have more money. The key to more money is Rotarians giving to the annual fund. Or as Eric said, you could give specifically to the World Fund of those couple of those items that he talked about. So I don't really believe it will hurt us. I think it is something that's, nobody likes change, but it is a change that we have to make in order to continue to spread the available funds we have.
Thank you. So a couple, like more of a technical question. So I'm hoping to bring up Jim Barnes to talk about this. So there's a question about, some of these policy changes that have happened, not only this set, but kind of last July. The question is, why limit the World Fund match to 80% without clarifying if a $30,000 minimum project budget is still required? So perhaps a little clarity on sort of what is required right now with
Sure.
global.
Certainly. First of all, I think it's important to revisit the fact that part of the vision for Future Vision was to make certain that we increased the impact of each grant. And one of the desired outcomes of the program was to see, as it departed from the matching grant program, to see larger, more impactful grants take place. And if you take a look at the numbers over time, that's exactly what's happened. So the $30,000 budget figure for grants is not intended to be a hindrance. It's supposed to be to make certain that we continue down that path towards larger and more impactful grants. Having said that, the $30,000 figure is the minimum budget that we've got. Grant sponsors can use a combination of district designated funds, cash, or directed gifts and endowment earnings to fund global grants. The foundation will continue to provide going forward, starting July 1st, as past President John pointed out, an 80% World Fund match for all DDF contributions. The maximum World Fund match for any one particular grant is $400,000, but there's no minimum. So that's not going to be perceived, or should not be perceived, as a hindrance. Previously, the World Fund minimum was $15,000. And hopefully that clarifies it and that makes it more confusing. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. And actually another change that occurred last year, and we had a question here, is, TRF has waived the minimum requirement for international partner contributions this year. And will that continue? And I can answer that yes, that will continue. That was a policy change that is sustaining. So that's another change.
Well, and I think it's important to kind of underscore the intention of these changes and the reason why the trustees took so long to take a look at options and to consider them thoroughly was to make certain that we were not rolling out policy changes every year, reacting to short-term changes in either the economy or the environment. So the intention is to stick with these changes for a number of years. But as with everything else, the trustees will be evaluating what's happening and making decisions each year depending on what circumstances dictate.
Thanks, Jim. And you may have answered the next question I was going to ask, but maybe we just kind of repeat this to make sure we're addressing, because this was probably the most commonly asked question that we received was, are these changes permanent? Will we return to this DDF match of 100%? Could we see that happening in the future? Also, the cash match, the grants cash match, will that come back? This was something we saw over and over. And John Germ, I'm wondering if you might be able to speak to that question.
Well, I'll try, Nora. That is obviously a very tough question. If we have less requests for grants, then obviously the trustees are going to be looking at what can we do to still provide the money that we need for the global grants. I hate to keep going back to it, but it says, if we want to meet the Rotarian needs, if we want to meet what the Rotarians feel is applicable in their community, we got to have more money. Now, how do we get more money? Jim just said we've been making these decisions 1 year at a time. And that's not fair to Rotarians. That's not fair to our customers. And our customers are the Rotarians, and their customers are the people in the community. So let's think about how we can look at setting something that's going to be long term. You know, you have goals, and they're short term, and they're medium, and then they're long term. We believe that this is a long term solution. We do not see the needs decreasing. So therefore, we have to have the additional funds. So I do not believe you will see these any changes within the next year or two, but it still depends on what the needs are and how we can fulfill those needs.
Thank you, John. And one other question, I think, John, you did address this in your comments, but just to reiterate, so it's clear, you know, the question was, you know, could the savings from the reduction of travel this past year because of COVID and how everyone has had such limited travel, could those savings be passed on to the World Fund?
Legally, not necessarily so, because we are two separate legal entities. There are restrictions on how you transfer funds and between organizations. So, you know, I think that hopefully we're going to be back to normal, and I'm sure that the RI board and the trustees will be looking at how do we continue to evaluate our operational costs. Are there ways that we can cut some of our operational costs? Can we reduce some travel? Can we use the expertise that we've learned on how to do Zoom meetings because of what COVID did in order to have more committee meetings and not travel so much to, say, bring people all around the world into Evanston for a committee meeting that we might be able to do on a Zoom meeting. So I think the trustees and the RI board are going to be evaluating that. So yes, we are going to be trying to reduce our cost because we believe that the more money we can put into serving our constituency is much better for the foundation.
That's great. Thank you, John. And I will also point out that that was a big source of the $7.5 million that the RI board was able to identify and come to an agreement with the trustees to transfer over to help fund that gap for this year.
And Nora, let me say also, last year, the RI board did in fact transfer some funds in order to help with about $30 million worth of COVID grants that came through the Rotary Foundation. I believe they put up about $3.5 million, and then the Rotary Foundation reduced our World Fund by dedicating $3.5 million to the COVID to then match other grants that came in. So we do have a great working relationship, and I think we'll continue with that relationship.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we will move on to the next policy change. So I'll ask Barry to speak to that.
Thank you, Nora. Now here we're going to talk about the annual fund share distribution. And I apologize with throwing so many numbers at you today, but it really is important that we understand and take some time to understand the changes when we do these splits, because it is in our terminology for a long time, and we need to really be able to spread the word so that people are clear. As you know, currently the annual fund share contributions are split equally between the World Fund and DDF, with 5% of the total share contributions being deducted only from the World Fund to help pay for operating expenses. Thus, currently a donor's $100 contribution to the annual fund share is allocated 50% to DDF, 45% to the World Fund, and 5% to operating expenses. Now, beginning July 1, 2021, all annual fund share contributions will first have 5% directed to operating expenses, and the remaining will then be split equally between the World Fund and DDF. For example, as you can see on the chart, a $100 contribution will generate $5 for operating expenses, and the remaining $95 will be divided equally, with $47.50 for DDF and $47.50 for the World Fund. Please note that this change will not affect districts' DDF until July 1, 2024, following the 3-year investment cycle that we're all familiar with. So let's talk about how we need to adjust our messaging. We're all familiar with the phrase, half comes back to our district. We have to remember, yes, half is coming back, but half of what? When referring to the annual fund share system. This concept will need to be adjusted to convey that half comes back after the 5% is deducted for operating expenses. Clubs and districts can help by updating their messaging, training materials, and websites accordingly. This change is expected to increase the amount available for grants by approximately $3 million and reduces the pressure on the World Fund because half of the amount from the World Fund that covered operating expenses will now be available for funding global grants. Sounds like a win-win to me.
Thank you, Barry. So let's also, pause here and really dig into this policy change too. Lots of questions on this one. To start, and Eric Schmeling, you might be best positioned to answer this. Let's talk about that 5%. A common question was, is this a new percentage that is taken from the annual fund?
Sure, thanks, Nora. So the 5% itself is not new. Kind of the new wrinkle is where that 5% is drawn from. As Barry showed on the slide there, it used to all come out of the World Fund portion. Going forward, part of it will come from the DDF, what used to be all DDF, and part of it will continue to come out of the World Fund. But the 5% is not new, and it doesn't suggest an increase in operating expenses for the foundation either. It's just as how are those expenses being covered?
Thanks, Eric. And while we have you, another question that came up very frequently is this change, or any of the changes really here, going to impact our charity navigator rating?
Yeah, another great question. And I know Rotarians, and we take great pride in the foundation having 13 consecutive years of a 4-star rating from Charity Navigator. Its highest rating that it gives to charities puts us in the top 1% of charities evaluated. So the good news is that our Charity Navigator ratings won't be impacted by this decision. Charity Navigator and other similar organizations take into account many different factors, and the foundation will continue to receive top marks for its financial health, efficiencies, accountability, transparency, and impact.
Thank you, Eric. Another question is just getting a better understanding of operating expenses. And so Julie Burke, perhaps you could address that. What are operating expenses?
Sure, thank you, Nora. So operating expenses are the activities that fall within fund development and general administration. Fund development expenses, those include costs that are associated with soliciting and processing contributions, and also the related recognition. It also includes things like printing, publicity, mailing, and just all fundraising activities. General administration expenses are costs associated with activities that are not directly associated with a single program. And these costs include corporate governance, senior leader support, and other activities that are indispensable to support the operations and organizational meetings.
Thank you, Julie. Again, kind of is sort of like a fundraising question. Again, there's a lot of questions about how these changes may impact the motivation for Rotarians to give. Barry, I'm wondering if you can address this question. Are there specific strategies for increasing the World Fund?
You know, for me, it's all about E-Ray. We're all familiar with every Rotarian, and I add every Rotarian and every Rotaractor every year. And it's up to all of us to convince all of our clubs, all of our Rotarians, all of our Rotaractors to give something, to give what you can to our foundation. Too many clubs are not supporting our foundation, and we need to stop that. We need to all be involved. This is our foundation. This is, as you heard, we're in the top 1% of charitable foundations. How could you not support that? This is who we are. This is what we need to do. So we need to reinforce our philosophy throughout the Rotary world that that's how we raise funds, and that's how we support our foundation, so we can do more and more around the world to help our world be a better place.
Thank you, Barry. Okay, so I think we'll move on now to the fourth policy change, and I'll ask you, John Germ, to take that.
Well, Dora, why do you always give me the tough ones, huh? But that's the way it goes. It's just alternating here. So I don't believe that's the right decision, but there we go. You know, one of the things that has always bothered me, and as we talk about grants and as we talk about the needs, we've always had more needs than we've had financial capabilities for. Part of that is because we all give to the Rotary Foundation for educational and humanitarian programs. We do not give money to the Rotary Foundation to sit in a bank account. A few years ago, we did an analysis, and we had what we call rollover. It's money that was given to be spent for grants that has not been spent and is maintained in that district's account. Last year, for example, a few years ago, it was well in excess of $50 million. This last year, on July the 1st, we carried over $48.8 million was carried over to the current Rotary year. So after much debate and consideration, realizing that we needed to give the districts ample time to use the funds that they have in their DDF, we said that as of the 1st of July, we will begin to age those amounts that are going into what we call DDF rollover. So if you look at the example, if you take a district at the end of 30 June of 2021 has $50,000 from their current year allocation that did not spend, it will go to DDF rollover. At the end of 30 June 22, it is still unspent. It is considered 1 year old. We chose 5 years because we felt that we needed to give the district sufficient time in order to evaluate how they could spend that money on global grants. That would also let us fund more global grants by using their rollover money. Many districts use all their money. They run out of capability of doing more global grants. So this hopefully will increase their opportunity to look at how can we best use this money. The DDF will first be applied from the current available year, and once that allocation has been exhausted, the oldest DDF will apply. Starting July the 1st of 2026, rollover DDF from 5 years ago or older will need to be applied to Polio Plus, Area Focus Endowment Funds, the General Endowment Fund, including the Rotary Peace Centers, Disaster Response Funds, or the World Fund. The district has the choice of how they want to disperse that rollover money, how it's applied. However, if the district does not choose one of those avenues, the default transfer will automatically be the World Fund. This DDF can be used for global grants, donation to another district, or any of the funds that just was mentioned above that I said about the endowment, polio, etc. We need to be sure that we have honored the intent of the donor. And the intent of that donor was to utilize these funds for educational and humanitarian programs. We chose 5 years. It could have been 3 years. But we needed not to rush into this. We needed to give the districts the opportunity through their leadership chain in order to decide how to spend that rollover money. Some districts are going to say, well, we intend to have this money so we can do grants of impact, major funds. There are districts around the world that have an excess of $500,000. Some of them even have $750,000 or more. You can do those grants of impact with that kind of funds. We don't need to continue to accumulate rollover funds. So let's be sure that the donations so generously given are put to good use as soon as possible. As you can see from the slide, the following decisions are projected to create a savings of, well, I'm ahead of myself. So I was going to go ahead and talk about how this money could end up increasing more funds available for the World Fund, but why don't we hold that until we get to the table of summation, Nora, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Let's pause there and talk about this DDF policy change a bit. I appreciate you talking about the decision of that 5-year limit, because it was a question that came up a lot. Why the 5 years? You know, there seem to be some folks that were interested in even a shorter timeline, and some on the opposite of no timeline. So I appreciate you talking about kind of that length of time, you know, giving Rotarians the time to plan for this. Obviously, a lot goes into planning for global grants, and this is a big change. So that 5-year runway should really give districts an opportunity to plan ahead. And also another thing, just you had said this in the comments, in your comments, but this was a question that came up about, you know, what is the structure here for this funding? Is it FIFO, first in, first out? Is it LIFO, last in, first out? And you talked about how DDF will be first applied from the current available year, and then once that allocation has been exhausted, that's where FIFO comes into play. The oldest DDF will be applied. So another question we received here from Julie Burke, might be best prepared for this. If all the DDF has never been used and it remains with TRF, what was made with those dividends?
Thank you, Nora. So unspent DDF, it remains in the annual fund where it's invested and generates earnings which support operations in the World Fund. So if it's not spent, it stays within that portfolio until it is spent.
Thanks, Julie. And while we have you here, another question that we've seen really frequently is how would a district know what their DDF balance is going forward?
Yes, so we will be preparing reports at the end of this fiscal year 21, whatever DDF rollover is remaining, that will be, even if it's for previous years, that will be considered 1 year old at the end of the fiscal year 22. And so the reports that we are developing will show each year how much is 1 year old, 2 year old, 3 year old, etc. And then when it gets to the point where one of those categories is layers as 5 years, then that's when the districts will make a decision as to what indicate whether they'll be spending it by the end of that fiscal year or any remaining funds where they would be directed.
Great. Okay, thank you. So just to be clear, that's not a report that has existed today, but it is one that will be built, and so districts will have several years of notice about where they stand with their DDF balance.
That's correct.
Great. Okay, so I might just ask you to continue, John Germ, with talking about sort of the overall financial impact of these decisions.
Before I talk about the overall impact, let me digress a little bit, if you don't mind, because there's a lot of questions coming up about how do we increase the money available for the World Fund. Well, one of the things that Julie could address this, or Eric can, but we've got a goal of setting $2.025 billion by 2025. Remember, the part of the income off of the endowment goes into the helping the World Fund. So, Julie, you want to address that a little bit before I start into the overall decisions of what these decisions might have a financial impact on? Because I think a lot of people don't understand that the makeup of the World Fund, as you alluded to earlier, does increase the more money we have in endowments, the more income we have off of those investments, so the more money that can come into the World Fund.
Yes, and we do have a slide on that as well near the end, unless we want to show it now. But it does, as the endowment fund increases, and we do have the goal of for 2025 to have the $2 billion 25. That and within expectancies, that will increase the amount of earnings that are generated from the endowment fund. And there is a spending policy of spending a certain percentage of the earnings each year, and that's based on how is that original contribution's market value compared to how does it compare to the original contribution? If it's underwater, where it's less than what the original contribution is, there would be nothing taken from that amount. But if it's higher than because of accumulated earnings, then there's a percentage. And so as the years go by and that amount, the total corpus of the endowment fund increases, the funds available increase for what the donors anticipate, designated purpose is.
I just thought it might be appropriate to talk, since we talked a lot of questions about how do we get more money into the World Fund, that it was more appropriate to let us talk about that and let people have a better understanding that we are looking at different ways, and by increasing the endowment is just one of the ways. It's not totally dependent upon the annual giving program, but the majority of the funds do come from the annual giving. But we do have a slide that we can show you that does talk about the decisions that we've made and the income that we anticipate coming in from those decisions. So we think that what we have shown you today and what the trustees have approved and presented to the district governors-elect and other individuals, that by having a total of, this gives us about $18.3 million beginning the 1st of July of 2021. And then we get another $3 million starting 1 July 2024. Now, if you recall earlier, we talked about the need of $17.6 million. But that's assuming that we don't have any more increases in demand out there. That's assuming that the districts and the Rotarians don't find any more projects. We know that's not going to be true. We know we've got the environment coming along. We don't know the impact of what those grants are going to be. So we believe we do need these additional funds. And that's why we were looking at this being a long-term approach and not just a stopgap measure. So we believe that 18.3 million starting July the 1st of 2021 is what we will be having. And then we'll get this other 3 million, which is the 5% of the current year annual fund share contribution that Mary talked about, will be another $3 million that will come in effective July the 1st of 2024. So we believe that this is going to sustain our foundation for many years, and we do believe that we need to look long term. And then if you look at the endowment fund history, which Julie and I were talking about a little bit ago, you can see what we anticipate happening there. So I think it's best for us right now to try to answer any other additional questions, Nora. We've thrown a lot of numbers out there today. Numbers are dollars, and dollars is what makes the world go around. So that's what's helping us with our grants. That's what's helping serve the needs. It also lets us address unforeseen circumstances. I don't know that anybody would have ever anticipated the problems we were going to be in, the opportunities that we were going to have because of COVID. But yet the foundation was able to do over $30 million worth of total grants there. Where's that money come from? We've talked about that, but we've also talked about how do we protect ourselves for the future by looking ahead and saying, what in fact can we do?
Thank you so much, John. And just a note for our participants today, these slides will be available. I think we really tried to make some very simple visuals to help prepare our foundation leadership, all of you here, in helping to spread the messaging. And so we encourage you to use these slides and cascade this messaging down. A couple of questions that came in here that we'd like to throw out. And John, maybe you could answer this one. It's related to spending for Polio Plus. Are there any projections of the spending necessary for Polio Plus in the future based on current conditions? Is any reduction in spending projected in the future, and will that benefit global grants funding availability?
Well, the first decision we took was to reduce the amount of money that came out of the World Fund for polio. That's about $5 million. The Global Polio Eradication Initiative, which consists of Rotary, which started this back in 1979, and then started it back in '85. We raised the money for continuing on with our program. But their current budget is about $1.2 billion per year. Now, some people will say, well, if you're down to 140 cases, which is what we were last year, why are you spending this kind of money? Well, first of all, we still have to protect all of the children. We're still providing vaccine and vaccinating over 400 million children per year until polio is eradicated. So short term, it takes 3 years after the last case. So let's suppose that we have the last case in 2022. I don't believe we're going to get there in 21, but let's say we get there in 22. We still have to go all those children. We still have to provide surveillance. We still have to have healthcare workers. And those healthcare workers have been used recently for COVID, previously used for Ebola. Our laboratories, which were part of our polio campaign, was also used for yellow fever and Ebola, SARS previously, that some of us can remember. So I don't see a reduction in the budget very low much for several years. So I think we're still going to be raising funds for polio. Our agreement with the Gates Foundation goes through 2023, and we've already begun talking about a continuation of the new strategic plan and more funding for that.
Thank you so much for sharing that, John. A couple more questions here. I might ask Jim Barnes to come online to talk about this, but Barry and John have any comments on this as well. One is about programs to scale, and the other is about district grants. So the first one, are programs to scale absolutely necessary? How is that grant type decided? And, this money could be used for several communities.
Sure thing. Programs of scale are kind of a natural extension or growth of the Global Grant Program and its commitment through Future Vision to increase impact. And the way that it's currently structured, and this is the maiden voyage for programs of scale this year, is by looking for partnerships that can be sustained through a reasonable investment on the part of the Rotary Foundation, and partnering with other organizations so that there's kind of a multiplier effect, and we end up having a rather large impact well beyond what could be accomplished through purely from the investment from Rotary International. It's also built on the skills that have been acquired by Rotarians through participation in the Global Grant Program. So that's, and I'm a big advocate for the programs of scale. That's where it fits into our kind of array of activities that allow us to have an impact in communities. You said there was a question about
district grants. Yeah.
District grants. Okay.
Yeah. So this is another similar question we've received in the past. To have the trustees considered allowing more district grant youth, as they have for this year and last year. There was a pilot program that allowed an increase in district grant use of DDF, and the question is as a way to help reduce the carryover DDF.
Well, and the answer to that is yes, as evidenced by the 2-year pilot program, and it's still running. The trustees will take a look at the results of what was accomplished during that 2-year pilot program and make decisions based on what took place.
Nora, can I go back to part of Jim's answer on the projects of scale?
Yes, please. Thank you.
The other thing that a project of scale will do will let us attract other partners. And let's don't forget that we do have partners out there, or people that are interested in working with Rotary. For example, the $2 billion that we're investing into the malaria program in Zambia is also getting $2 million from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and also it's getting $2 million from the World Vision. So our $2 billion has become $6 billion. So let's think about that. If when you say a project of scale, it's not just putting more Rotary money into it, it's putting more Rotary money along with other partners. We wouldn't get that $4 million if we out there if we didn't have this project that was identified that's going to reduce malaria in these areas by about 95% or better. So let's just think about the increasing potential for additional partners in order to make this happen. We've got a partnership arrangement similar to this with USAID and with the Cook Foundation on food supply. So there's a lot of things like that that we can reach out that can also help our reach out into the communities.
Thank you, John. And that about brings us to our time for the day. So I want to thank all of our panelists for bringing us through this discussion, and all of our attendees for these excellent questions throughout. We hope that this was helpful to you, and that the assets that we'll provide following this webinar will be helpful as well. This session will be recorded so you can access this in the future. Thank you for all of our staff, our back channel staff who have helped to answer these questions that have come in through the chat pane. If we didn't get a chance to answer your question, or if you think of anything else, please don't hesitate to email Rotary Support Center at rotary.org, or you can reach out to your PRF gift officer or grant officer. And that's it for today. Thank you all for your participation.